My name is Claire Whitfield. I was 32 years old the night my mother rang me at 2 in the morning to inform me that I was permitted to attend my own brother's engagement dinner, provided I met one condition. Keep your mouth shut. That's what she said. No hello. No how are you keeping. Just an order, delivered the way you'd bark at someone who was still 18 and hadn't yet earned the right to think for herself. Her reasoning was straightforward enough. My brother Nathan's fiancée had a father, a decorated colonel, retired from the British Army, and my mother was petrified I'd humiliate the family the way she claimed I always did. So I smiled into the darkness of my hotel room and said, "Got it." I ended the call. I turned and looked at the uniform hanging in the closet beside the dress I'd bought specifically for that dinner. My dress blues, captain's bars sitting on the shoulders, 3 deployment patches stitched onto the sleeve. My mother had no idea, or perhaps simply didn't care, that the very colonel she was so desperate to please had once pinned a medal to my chest 3 years earlier at Camp Ellsworth. She didn't know because she had never bothered to ask. What happened at that dinner table is the reason I'm sitting here telling you this story now. Welcome back to Hidden Family Revenge. This is the channel where we tell stories about family secrets, broken trust, and the moments people finally find the nerve to stand up for themselves. If Claire's story feels familiar to you, drop a comment, and don't forget to subscribe. Let me take you back to that phone call. I had driven 7 hours from Camp Ellsworth, Kent, to Winchester, England that same afternoon. 7 hours of Wheeled Ridge Highway and rest stop coffee, all so I could sit at a table with people who clearly wished I wasn't coming. I checked into a Kingsgate Inn near the interstate around 9 o'clock, showered, set my alarm for 600, purely out of habit, and then at 2:07 in the morning, my phone lit up. Mom. I picked up because that's simply what you do when your mother calls in the dead of night. You answer because some part of you thinks somebody must be dead. Nobody was dead. Tomorrow, she said, you can join your brother's fiancée's family for dinner, but keep your mouth shut. Her voice carried that particular edge she gets when she's rehearsed her lines beforehand. I asked her why. She didn't even pause. Her dad's a decorated colonel. Don't embarrass us like you always do. Like I always do. As though there existed some catalog of my failures that she kept filed away in a drawer somewhere, alphabetized and cross-referenced for easy retrieval. I sat on the edge of the hotel bed in my t-shirt and running shorts, the phone warm against my ear, and I said, "Got it." She hung up first. She always hangs up first. I set the phone down on the nightstand and looked across the room at the closet, the dress blues on the left, the black dress on the right. 2 versions of me, hanging side by side in a roadside hotel room in the very town where I'd grown up and never quite belonged. 14 years earlier, I'd been standing in our kitchen on Thornfield Avenue with an enlistment contract laid out on the counter and my mother's face gone white as a dinner plate. My father had been gone 2 years by then. Heart attack at 51, mid-shift at the paper mill. Mom had just gotten her catering business off the ground out of that same kitchen. Trays of deviled eggs and pulled pork sliders lined up along the counter right next to my paperwork. She needed help. She needed me to stay. Nathan was 14 and useless with a chafing dish. "I raised you to be here," she told me. "Not for me, for her." I tried to explain that the army wasn't about leaving at all. It was about building something that belonged to me, something I could stand on that nobody had handed me and nobody could take away. She didn't hear a word of it. The morning I left for basic training, I loaded my duffel into the trunk of a taxi at 6 in the morning. She stood on the step in her bathrobe. She didn't hug me. She said, "If you walk out that door, don't expect me to wait." I walked out. She didn't wait. Over the 14 years that followed, every holiday visit felt like a performance review I'd already failed before it started. Margaret Whitfield, that's my mother, Margaret, treated me like a guest she hadn't actually invited. Polite, distant, cold, in the kind of way that leaves no fingerprints behind. Nathan learned the lesson early on. He stayed. He helped with the catering. He picked up her calls on the first ring. And in the quiet arithmetic our family ran on, staying equaled love and leaving equaled betrayal. I hadn't left to hurt her. I left because staying would have cost me everything I was becoming. Morning came. 6 a.m. alarm. 30 minutes of push-ups and planks on the hotel carpet because the gym didn't open until 7. Black coffee from the lobby machine. A phone call to my unit back at Campbell about a supply manifest for an upcoming training rotation. Nothing urgent, but I checked in anyway, because that's how I'm built. Routine keeps me level. Routine is the thing that holds the rest of me together when everything else threatens to slide sideways. At 8:15, my phone buzzed. Nathan, a text. Dinner tonight at Ashwood Grill. 7 p.m. Dress nice. And Claire, just sit there and smile. Talk about the army stuff. It makes people uncomfortable. I rate it twice. The army stuff. 14 years of service, 3 deployments, a commendation medal, and a supply chain that had kept 3 forward operating bases fed and fueled in Nangar province. And my own brother called it the army stuff. Like it was some hobby of mine. Like I collected stamps. I didn't reply. Instead, I opened the closet. The dress blues on the left, the black dress on the right. I reached for the dress, not because I was ashamed of the uniform. I have never once been ashamed of it, but because tonight belonged to Nathan's engagement, not mine. Showing up in uniform to somebody else's celebration would have made me the headline, and that wasn't the point at all. The point was seeing my brother's face before I deployed again in 60 days. That was the entire reason I'd driven 7 hours. Just his face. That was it. Around 10 o'clock, another text arrived. Unknown number. I opened it. It was from Sophie Ashford, Nathan's fiancée. He'd apparently given her my number. Hi, Claire. So excited to finally meet you tonight. Nathan's told me so much about you. Just a heads up. My dad is pretty traditional, so try to keep things light and fun, okay? He doesn't love heavy topics at dinner. I stared at the screen. Nathan's told me so much about you. That sentence carried a weight I could measure precisely. The question was exactly what he'd told her. I called Nathan. He picked up on the 3rd ring, his voice tight and cheerful in that particular way it gets when he's performing. Hey, what's up? What exactly did you tell Sophie about me? A pause, the kind that tells you someone is deciding how much truth they're willing to spend. Just the basics, that you've been traveling, doing your own thing. You know Mom doesn't love the army talk. Traveling, I said. You told her I've been traveling. Look, it's just easier this way. Her dad's a colonel, Claire, a real one. He doesn't need to hear about... He stopped himself, but not quickly enough. About what, Nathan? Silence. The highway kind. Long and flat with nothing on either side. Just be normal tonight, please. He hung up. I sat on the edge of the bed and set the phone down carefully, the way you set something down when you're trying not to throw it. My brother didn't merely want me quiet. He was embarrassed by me. Not by anything I'd done, but by everything I'd become. A real one, he'd said. As though there were some other kind. Ashwood Grill sat on a corner in downtown Winchester. Stone facade, burgundy awning, the sort of restaurant where the napkins are cloth and the hostess knows your name if you dine there often enough. Private dining room in the back. Table for 12. I arrived at 6:55, 5 minutes early, because the army trains that into you and civilian life never manages to train it back out. Margaret was already there. She stood at the far end of the table, arranging white roses in a low glass vase, her back turned to the door. She wore a navy dress and pearls. When she turned and saw me, her eyes swept from my shoes to my hair in a single motion, the way a sergeant inspects a private. At least you dressed properly for once, she said. No hello. No, you look nice. Just a grade. Pass, barely. Nathan and Sophie arrived together a few minutes after that. Sophie was petite, blonde, smiling in the way people smile when they're nervous about something going right. She crossed the room and took my hand. Oh, you must be the sister. Nathan told me you've been traveling. Where to lately? Traveling. That word again. Stamped right onto my forehead. I smiled. All over, I said, because it was true, just not in the way she meant it. Margaret directed me to my seat, 6 chairs down from the head of the table, where a place card read Colonel Richard Ashford, retired. I looked at that name. My pulse ticked up a notch. Richard Ashford. I tilted my head. That name. I knew that name. Before the Ashford side arrived, Margaret pulled me aside into the hallway, outside the private room. Burgundy carpet. Dim sconce lighting. She leaned in close enough that I caught the scent of her hairspray, the same brand she'd been using since I was 12 years old. "I need you to listen carefully," she said. "The Harlans think Nathan comes from a stable family. 2 children, both doing well. I told them you work in hospitality, hotel management, something like that. If they ask, just nod." I blinked. "You told them I work in hotel management? It's close enough to what you do. You manage supplies or whatever it is." "I'm a quartermaster corps officer, Mom. I manage supply lines for 3 forward operating bases in Nangar province." She waved her hand, a small, dismissive gesture, as though she were shooing a fly. "Same idea, different words. Just don't correct me in there." She turned and walked back into the dining room. I stood in that hallway for 10 seconds, maybe 15. I'd known she minimized my career. I'd expected exactly that. But this was something else entirely. She hadn't downplayed what I did. She'd replaced it. She'd constructed an entirely different Claire. One without the uniform, without the rank, without the deployments, without the medal, and handed that version over to the family of a retired colonel. She had erased me. And she'd done it so smoothly, so completely, that I understood immediately this wasn't some spur-of-the-moment lie. She'd been telling it long enough to believe it herself. I walked back in, sat down, placed my napkin across my lap, and waited. Sitting there at the table, I kept turning it over in my mind. She hadn't simply asked me to be quiet. She'd asked me to be someone else entirely. She had built a whole other version of me, one without the uniform, without the service, without a single thing I had earned. If you've ever been erased by someone who was supposed to be proud of you, stay with me. This story is about to turn. The front door of the restaurant opened at 7:12. I heard it from my seat. The creak of the hinge, then a voice I recognized the way you recognize a song from the first 2 notes. Deep, measured, the kind of voice that spent 30 years giving orders to rooms full of people who listened the first time. Colonel Richard Ashford walked into the private dining room with his wife Eleanor a half step behind him. He wore a charcoal blazer over a white shirt. No uniform, but the way he carried himself, shoulders back, chin level, eyes scanning the room left to right before committing to a single step. That was uniform enough on its own. Eleanor was elegant. Silver hair, pearl earrings, the calm smile of a woman who had hosted hundreds of military functions and never once lost her composure. Margaret was on her feet before they'd even cleared the doorway. "Colonel Ashford, what an honor." Too loud, too eager. The colonel smiled politely. "Richard, please, I'm retired." He shook Nathan's hand. Sophie kissed his cheek. He said something warm to his daughter that I couldn't quite catch. Then he looked around the table. His gaze moved across the faces. Margaret, Nathan's college friend, Sophie's cousin, and stopped on me. 1 second, maybe 2. His brow creased, a micro-expression, the kind you learn to read when your job depends on reading people who aren't trying to be read. I knew him. Camp Ellsworth, 3 years back. He'd stood at a podium and called my name. I'd marched forward, saluted, and he'd pinned the Distinguished Service Medal onto my chest. But I didn't say a word. I nodded. He nodded back. Margaret took his arm and steered him toward the head of the table, and the moment passed. Almost. Appetizers came out. Shrimp cocktail, bruschetta, the sort of food you eat with your fingers while pretending not to notice the tension in the room. Margaret ran the conversation the way she ran her catering events. A tight schedule, controlled portions, no room whatsoever for surprises. She talked about Winchester, about the catering business, about the new farmers market on Kingsley Avenue. Nathan nodded along and filled in color wherever she left gaps. Sophie smiled and touched Nathan's arm. It was a well-rehearsed production, and I was the audience member who hadn't been handed a program. Eleanor Ashford sat across from me, 2 seats to my left. She watched Margaret with the quiet patience of a woman who has attended enough dinners to know exactly when the host is performing. Then she turned to me. "And what does your other daughter do, Margaret?" The question floated across the table like a paper airplane. Light, simple, impossible to dodge. Margaret didn't miss a single beat. "Oh, Claire works in hospitality, hotel management. She's been traveling quite a bit. You know how that industry is." I heard the words come out of my mother's mouth, and I felt each one land like a small, precise cut. Hotel management, traveling, that industry. I looked down at my plate. The shrimp sat curled on its bed of ice, pink and perfectly still. From the head of the table, Colonel Ashford set down his fork. He looked at me, then at Margaret, then back at me again. He picked up his napkin, dabbed the corner of his mouth, and said nothing. Nathan jumped in. "So, Sophie, tell everyone about the venue you found for the reception." The subject changed, but the Colonel's eyes didn't. Eleanor wasn't the type to let a thread simply drop. Somewhere between the appetizer plates being cleared and the entrees arriving, she turned to me again with the easy warmth of a woman who'd spent 3 decades making young lieutenants' spouses feel welcome at battalion dinners. "Hotel management," she said. "That must keep you busy. Where are you based?" I weighed my options. I could lie, which would make me complicit. I could tell the truth, which would detonate my mother's entire fiction right there at the table. Or I could walk the razor's edge between the two. "I'm based in Kent right now," I said. "It's high-paced work, a lot of logistics." "Kent. That's lovely. What hotel chain?" "It's a government operation, actually." The word government landed softly, but it landed. Eleanor's eyebrows lifted a fraction. Margaret's hand appeared from nowhere, reaching across the table for the breadbasket, angling her body between Eleanor and me. "Claire, would you pass the bread?" I passed the bread. Eleanor let it go, but Colonel Ashford didn't. I caught him from the corner of my eye. He'd set down his water glass and was looking at me the way a man looks at a puzzle he's 90% certain he's already solved. Government operation. Kent. Logistics. 3 data points. He tilted his head slightly, just a single degree, and I watched recognition assemble itself behind his eyes the way a weather system builds along the horizon. Slow, certain, and impossible to stop once it's begun. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. Held it low, under the table. Scrolled through something. I didn't look directly, but I could feel it happening. He was checking. Main course. Pan-seared trout for most of the table. Steak for Nathan, who had never once in his life eaten fish without complaining about it. Sophie, seated across from me, had been quiet through most of the meal. Watching. Absorbing. Filing things away. Now she leaned forward, elbows off the table the way a colonel's daughter would, and said, "So what exactly do you do? Like, day to day?" I glanced at Margaret. She was mid-sip, but her eyes locked onto mine over the rim of her glass. A warning, as clear as a traffic light. I looked back at Sophie. "I make sure people have what they need," I said. "Food, fuel, equipment, in places where those things aren't easy to come by." Sophie smiled. "Oh, like event planning for remote venues?" Oh, Nathan jumped in before I could answer. "Something like that." I picked up my fork, set it down, picked it up again. "Something like that," I said. Under the table, my right hand drifted to the pocket of my dress. The fabric was thin enough that I could feel the edge of the challenge coin through it. Heavy, round, cool against my thigh. Colonel Ashford had handed it to me the same day he'd pinned the medal on. It's a tradition. You don't buy a challenge coin, you earn one, or someone who matters gives you one. I carried it the way some people carry a photograph. Not to show anyone, just to know it was there. Across the table, the colonel was looking at his phone again. This time he wasn't scrolling. He was staring at something on the screen. His jaw tightened just slightly, just enough for someone trained to notice. Between the entree and dessert, Eleanor excused herself. Margaret followed, the way she always follows anyone she's trying to manage. I watched the two of them disappear toward the restroom and knew exactly what was about to happen. Margaret would steer. Eleanor would listen. And somewhere in that conversation, my mother would reinforce the fiction she'd built. I found out later from Eleanor herself exactly what was said. Eleanor had leaned against the marble counter and mentioned, casually, "Your daughter seems very measured, very composed for someone in hospitality." Margaret had adjusted her earring in the mirror. "She's always been quiet, not much ambition, honestly. Nathan's the one with drive." Eleanor had pushed a little further, gently. "She mentioned a government operation. Is she with a hotel on a military base, maybe?" And my mother, the woman who had spent 30 years feeding people in Winchester, England, the woman who makes her own pie crust and irons her own tablecloths, had looked Eleanor Ashford straight in the face and said, "Something like that. She's never been very clear about what she does. You know how some kids are." Eleanor had nodded, smiled politely, but something didn't sit right. And Eleanor Ashford had spent 3 decades as a military spouse. She could smell a briefing that didn't add up the same way a baker smells when the bread has gone wrong. When the two of them walked back in, Eleanor leaned close to the colonel's ear. I couldn't hear what she said, but I saw his face. He closed his eyes for 1 second, opened them, looked directly at me, and I knew then he wasn't guessing anymore. Here's what Colonel Ashford had found on his phone. I didn't learn this until weeks later, when he told me himself over coffee at his home in Chesterfield. But I'll tell you now, because the timing matters. Somewhere between Eleanor's first question and Margaret's hallway lie, the colonel had opened his photo gallery and typed a single word into the search bar. Whitfield. The phone returned 4 results, all from the same day, the DSM ceremony at Camp Ellsworth, 3 years prior. In the first photo, the colonel stood at a podium reading a citation. In the second, he was shaking a young officer's hand. In the third, the one that mattered, he was pinning the Distinguished Service Medal onto the uniform of Captain Claire Whitfield. My face was in 3/4 profile, hair pulled tight under my beret, eyes forward, shoulders square. He zoomed in. Then he looked up from his phone and looked at me. The same woman sitting at the end of a dinner table in a black dress, being introduced as a hotel manager who'd been drifting from place to place. Same cheekbones, same posture, same stillness under pressure. He told me later that his first feeling wasn't anger. It was confusion. He simply couldn't understand why a mother would erase her own daughter's service. In his world, the world of military families, of sacrifice and deployment and homecomings and folded flags, a child who serves is a child you brag about. You put the bumper sticker on the car, you frame the promotion photo, you tell every stranger at the grocery store, you don't pretend she works at a hotel. He put the phone face down on the table. He straightened his napkin. He looked at Eleanor. She looked back. Something passed between them. The kind of communication that takes 30 years of marriage to develop and 0 words to execute. Then he waited, because a colonel knows when to act and when to let a moment find its own shape. Dessert plates were coming out, chocolate torte, raspberry coulis. Margaret stood up and walked the length of the table toward my end, passing behind Nathan's chair, behind Sophie's cousin, behind the empty seat where Eleanor's coat hung. She stopped beside me, bent down, and spoke close to my ear. Her breath smelled like white wine. "You're doing fine," she said. "Just keep your mouth shut through the toast and we're done." There it was again. Keep your mouth shut. The same words from the phone call, the same instruction, the same leash. "I haven't said a word, Mom." "Good, that's all I'm asking." I looked at her, really looked at her. She was 58 years old and her makeup was perfect, and her pearls were straight, and her hands were shaking. Not a lot, just at the fingertips, like a person holding something heavy and pretending it's light. "No," I said quietly. "That's not all you're asking. You're asking me to not exist." Her chin lifted. "Don't be dramatic." She walked back to her seat. I watched her go. She smoothed her skirt as she sat down, picked up her fork, cut a precise triangle from her tart, and placed it in her mouth. It was the single most controlled performance I'd ever witnessed from a woman whose control was the only thing keeping her together. And I realized something I should have realized years earlier. My silence wasn't politeness. It wasn't respect. It was complicity. Every time I kept my mouth shut, I was helping her maintain a lie. Every quiet dinner, every nodded confirmation, every something like that, I had been an accomplice in my own erasure, but I still didn't act, because this dinner belonged to Nathan, not to me. That restraint felt noble at the time. It was also the last excuse I would ever make for her. Nathan seized the lull between dessert and coffee to make his pitch. I could see it coming, the way he adjusted his tie, the way he leaned toward Colonel Ashford's end of the table like a man angling for a handshake. "Sir, I don't know if Sophie mentioned it, but I'm starting an insurance agency here in Winchester," Nathan said. "We're specializing in coverage for military families. Life insurance, disability, retirement planning, it's a growing market." The colonel listened. He was good at that. 32 years of command teaches a man to let people talk long enough to reveal exactly who they really are. "That's a worthy cause," the colonel said. "Military families are underserved." Nathan beamed. "Exactly. And that's why I'd love to connect with some of your colleagues. If you have anyone in mind who might benefit from—" "How much do you know about military life, Nathan?" The question came quiet, almost gentle, but it stopped Nathan cold. "Well, I've done my research, read a lot of case studies, talked to some veterans at the—" "Research," the colonel said. He nodded slowly. Then he looked at me. Not a glance, a look. The kind that carries an entire sentence folded up inside it. He looked at the woman who had managed supply chains in a war zone, who had served under his command, who had earned a commendation, keeping soldiers fed and equipped under fire. And then he looked at the man who wanted to sell those same soldiers insurance policies. He looked back at Nathan. "Research is a good start," he said evenly. "Experience is better." Nathan laughed nervously. The table moved on. But the colonel's point had already landed, and everyone at that table who was paying attention had heard it. The table shifted for coffee, chairs scraping, people swapping seats to talk. Everyone, including me. Eleanor Ashford came and sat beside me. She did it the way a woman who spent decades as a military spouse does most things, casually, with a purpose tucked under the warmth. She stirred her coffee once, then twice, and said, "You said government operation and logistics, and you sit like somebody who's been told to sit up straight 10,000 times." She let that hang there a beat. "Are you military, Claire?" I held her gaze. She had kind eyes and a jaw that didn't back down from anything. I'd seen that exact look before, on the faces of military spouses who'd kept households running through deployments and reassignments and phone calls that came at 3 a.m. from somewhere on the other side of the world. Women who understood the cost of service because they'd been the ones paying it too. "Ma'am," I said, "I'm not going to lie to you at your daughter's engagement dinner." "Then don't." "I'm a captain, Quartermaster Corps, British Army." She set her coffee cup down carefully, like she was afraid it might slip from her fingers. "You're active duty?" "Yes, ma'am. And your family introduced you as hotel management." I said it flat. No sarcasm in it, no bitterness either. Just the fact, laid on the table, the way you lay down a hand of cards after you've already decided to fold, and you just want everyone to see what you'd actually been holding. Eleanor's hand rose to her chest. She glanced across the room at my mother, who was laughing at something Sophie's cousin had said. Then she looked back at me. "Does Richard know?" "I think he's working it out." She stood, squeezed my shoulder once, and walked to the colonel's side. I watched her bend down and murmur something into his ear. Whatever she said took about 4 seconds. The colonel listened without moving a muscle. Then he set his coffee cup down, folded his napkin, laid it beside his plate, and rose to his feet. "I'd like to propose a toast before we close out the evening," he said. The room went quiet. Not the polite quiet, the real kind, the kind where forks stop halfway to mouths and sentences die mid-word. My mother was smiling. I could see it from 6 seats away, the smile she saved for the moments she'd spent all night engineering. She thought the colonel was about to bless the engagement. Say something warm about Nathan and Sophie and everything ahead of them. This was supposed to be her moment, the one that made all the lying feel worthwhile. "I'd like to begin," the colonel said, "with something you weren't expecting." He stood there holding that glass, and I felt every set of eyes in the room shift toward him. My mother's smile stayed fixed in place. She had no idea that the man she'd spent the whole evening trying to impress already knew exactly who I was. What happened next, I still turn over in my mind every single day. The colonel held the glass at chest height, not raised. That's a military habit. You don't lift the glass until you're ready for people to drink to it, and he wasn't ready yet. "I've spent 32 years in the British Army," he said. His voice filled the room without any effort behind it. "And in that time I've learned you can tell everything you need to know about a family by watching how its members treat one another when they think no one important is paying attention." He let that sit. My mother's smile held, but something behind her eyes shifted just slightly. "Nathan, Sophie." He looked at them, warmth genuine and practiced at once. "I'm proud of you both. A marriage is a campaign. It takes planning, it takes sacrifice, and above everything else, it takes honesty." He said the word honesty, the way a judge says guilty. Final. No room left for argument. "Tonight," he went on, "I'd like to talk about honesty." My mother's smile flickered, just at the corners, the kind of micro-correction a pilot makes when a crosswind catches the wing. The colonel set his glass down. He pushed his chair back and began to walk. Not toward Nathan and Sophie, not toward the head of the table. He walked slowly, deliberately, the length of the table. Past Nathan's college friend, past Sophie's cousin, past the empty dessert plates, the coffee cups, the crumpled napkins, toward the far end, toward me. Every step registered like a drumbeat. My mother twisted in her seat, tracking him. "Richard," she said, her voice climbing an octave, "the children are down at the other end." He didn't stop. 5 steps, 6, 7. The room seemed to shrink with every one of them. I could feel my own pulse in my throat. Not fear, but recognition. This was the moment. Not one I'd planned or engineered or asked for, but one I'd earned simply by showing up and telling the truth to the one person who'd actually bothered to ask. He stopped directly in front of me. I looked up, he looked down. We held eye contact for a full 3 seconds, the length of a salute, the length of the breath you take right before you step off a ledge. Under the table, my hand found the challenge coin in my pocket. I pressed my thumb into the eagle stamped on its face. "Hello," the colonel said, gentle, but it carried to every corner of the room. "I'm surprised to see you here." "Good evening, Colonel," I said, quiet, steady, the voice I use when it actually matters. He nodded once. Then louder, loud enough for my mother, for Nathan, for Sophie, for every soul at that table, he asked, "Who are you to them?" The question went off like a silent detonation. The way real explosions work, the light arrives before the sound does, and for one fraction of a second, everything holds perfectly still, every head turned. My mother was half out of her chair. She's my daughter, Richard. She works in..." The colonel raised one hand, palm open, fingers straight. The universal command gesture. She stopped mid-sentence. "Captain," the colonel said, looking at me. The word dropped onto the table like a glass slipping from someone's hand. "Would you state your name and unit for everyone here?" I stood. Chair pushed back, shoulders square. Not quite at attention, I wasn't in uniform, but close enough that anyone at that table could feel the difference between a woman who'd learned to stand in a dining room and one who'd learned to stand on a parade ground. "Captain Claire Whitfield," I said. "2nd Logistics Battalion, Camp Ellsworth, Kent." The silence that followed was total. Not the uncomfortable kind, not awkward, the kind that happens when the floor of a room tilts and nobody can locate the walls anymore. Sophie looked at Nathan, mouth open, no words coming. Nathan looked at my mother. My mother looked down at the tablecloth. The colonel turned to face the table. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "I pinned the Distinguished Service Medal on this woman 3 years ago at Camp Ellsworth," he said, "for distinguished service during Operation Steadfast Guard, 12 months in Nangar Province. She managed the supply chain for 3 forward operating bases under active fire. Not once did a critical shipment fail on her watch." He paused, let it land fully. And tonight, her own family introduced her to me as a hotel manager. The word hotel cracked open like an egg against the edge of a counter. Clean, final, impossible to gather back up. I could feel the air in the room rearrange itself. The Colonel's friends looked at my mother. Sophie's cousin looked at Nathan. Eleanor looked at me with an expression that was equal parts fury and heartbreak. And my mother, Margaret Whitfield, 58 years old, catering business owner, pearls and hairspray and trembling fingers, sat frozen in her chair, mouth slightly open, and for the first time in her life had absolutely nothing to say. The dam gave way in slow motion. She stood. Her chair scraped against the hardwood, a sound like a nail dragged across slate. "Richard, I think there's been a misunderstanding," she said. "I never said, I just simplified things for conversation. You know how dinner parties are. People don't want to hear about." "Simplified?" the Colonel said. He wasn't even looking at her, still facing the table. "Mrs. Whitfield, you told my wife your daughter doesn't have a career. You said she's been drifting." Eleanor spoke for the first time, quiet and precise. "Those were her exact words, Margaret. Not much ambition." That's what she said. My mother's eyes went to Nathan, searching for backup, for the son who always stayed, always agreed, always carried her bags. Nathan was staring at his own hands. His phone sat face up on the table. The last text he'd sent me was still visible on the screen. "Please don't make this weird." He couldn't look at me. My mother's voice cracked. Not from tears, from pressure, like a pipe that's held too much for too long. "You don't understand our family, Colonel. Claire left us. She chose to leave when I needed her most. She chose the army over her own mother." She was shaking now. The composure she'd built her entire identity on was peeling away in strips, and underneath it was something raw and old and far more honest than anything she'd said all night. But she didn't know how to stop. She never had. The Colonel looked at me. "Captain, would you like to say something?" I stood again. I must have sat back down at some point without noticing, instinct or habit. I stood and looked around the table. At Sophie, whose engagement dinner had just turned into something else entirely. At Nathan, who still couldn't meet my eyes. At Eleanor, tears running silently down her face. At the Colonel, standing beside me like a witness at a hearing. And then at my mother. "I enlisted in the British Army at 18, I said. My voice level, clear, the voice I use briefing a commander when every word has to carry its own weight because there's no space left for filler. I earned my commission through Officer Candidate School at 22, Camp Redwoods, 6. I've deployed twice to Afghanistan and once to Kuwait. I've run supply chains in combat zones where the nearest backup was a helicopter ride and a prayer. I've sat with soldiers who shipped out and never shipped home." I paused. "Not for effect, for breath. Mom told you I'm in hotel management, told you I've been drifting. She's been telling that story for 14 years, to neighbors, to Nathan's friends, to you." I looked at my mother. "I didn't come here tonight to correct you, Mom. I came because Nathan's my brother and I wanted to see him before I deploy again in 60 days. That's it. That's the entire reason I drove 7 hours." I sat back down, placed my hands flat on the table, fingers still. Done. My mother was leaning against the back of her chair, like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Her mouth moved. Nothing came out. She looked the way a building looks a second before it drops, still standing, but hollowed out of everything that had ever held it together. Then she walked out of the dining room. Not dramatically, no slammed door. She simply stood, pressed her napkin flat against the table and left. I followed. Not to fight, not to finish anything off, because I'd seen something cross her face I hadn't seen in 14 years. Fear. Not the performed kind, not the theatrical worrying over napkin folds and seating charts. Real fear. The kind that lives underneath everything else a person shows the world. She was in the hallway, leaning against the wall near the restroom door, hands trembling again, and this time she wasn't bothering to hide it. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small photograph, wallet-sized, laminated, its edges gone soft from years of handling. I recognized it before I even saw the face. I'd seen it once before, years back, in a drawer she thought I didn't know about. Her mother. My grandmother. A young woman in a nurse's uniform, hair pinned back, looking into the camera with an expression that was half smile, half already leaving. She'd walked out when my mother was 11. Said she needed to find herself. Moved to Bristol. Took a nursing job at a hospital downtown. Never came back. Never called on a birthday. Never explained a thing. She left when I was younger than you, my mother said, her voice stripped down to something I barely recognized. She said she had to go. Said it was important. She touched the photograph with her thumb. She looked just like you when she said it. The same eyes, the same certainty. She looked up at me. When you enlisted, I saw her face in yours, like the door was already closing. So you made sure I had nothing to come back to, I said. She didn't answer. She just stood there holding a photograph of a woman who'd left, having been raised by a woman who never forgave the leaving, and having raised a daughter she then punished for the exact same sin. I walked back inside. When I sat down again, the colonel was standing at the head of the table. He'd waited, not out of patience, out of precision. He knew exactly what he was doing. I'd like to finish my toast, he said. Nobody argued. Nobody moved. My mother came back in and sat down without looking at anyone, staring at the tablecloth the way you look at a document you know you've signed wrong. I said marriage requires honesty, the colonel continued. So does family. And tonight I've learned that this family has a daughter who has served her country with distinction, and a mother who erased that service to impress people she barely knows. The sentence landed like a gavel. Clean. Final. My mother flinched. A full-body flinch, the kind you can't fake and can't hide. Nathan gripped the edge of the table with both hands, knuckles white, jaw locked. Sophie looked at him with the kind of look that asks a question nobody wants to answer. You knew? The only embarrassment at this table, the colonel said, calm, the way a man speaks when he spent 2 hours thinking something through and has decided to say it exactly once, is a mother who erased her own daughter's service. He lifted his glass. To Nathan and Sophie, may your marriage be built on truth, even when the truth is hard. He drank. Eleanor drank. I drank. Nathan lifted his glass with a hand that wasn't quite steady. My mother didn't touch hers. After the toast, the colonel walked back down to my end of the table while everyone else stayed seated. He stood in front of me. Captain Whitfield, he said, I remember your ceremony clearly. You'd just come back from 12 months in Helmond. You ran the supply chain for 3 FOBs under fire, fuel, rations, medical supplies, ammunition, in conditions that would have broken most people. He paused, the kind of pause that isn't about searching for words, but about choosing which ones deserve to be spoken. When I pinned that medal on you, you said something I wrote down that night. You said, it's not about getting recognized, sir, it's about getting it done. He let that sit. Well, tonight you deserve to be recognized. He extended his hand. I shook it. Firm grip, warm palm, 3 seconds. Eleanor stood and put her hand on my shoulder, squeezed once, the kind of squeeze that says everything a sentence can't manage. A mother should be the first person to tell the world who her daughter really is, she said, looking at my mother as she said it, not with anger, with something worse. Pity. I'm sorry yours didn't, I nodded. My throat had gone tight, my eyes wet. But I didn't cry. Not there. Not in front of that room. Not because crying is weakness. I've cried at a forward operating base at 3 in the morning when a supply convoy got hit. But that room hadn't earned my tears. My tears were mine. Same as my service was mine. Same as my name was mine. I turned to my mother. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, knuckles white, pearls shifted to one side, makeup still intact while the face underneath it had completely collapsed. The architecture of her composure broken from the inside out. I kept my mouth shut, Mom, I said, for 14 years. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Nothing came. I'm not angry, I said. I'm not going to yell at you in front of these people. That's not who I am. That was never who I am. I paused. But I need you to hear this. I am done being the daughter you wished I was, instead of the one I actually am. I picked up my purse from the back of the chair. I reached into the pocket of my dress and pulled out the challenge coin. Held it a moment. Felt its weight. The eagle on one face, the battalion crest on the other. Then I set it on the table directly in front of my mother. "That's from Colonel Ashford," I said. "He gave it to me the day he gave me the medal you've never once asked about. Keep it. Maybe it'll help you remember who I am next time you introduce me." I straightened my dress, looked at Nathan, standing near the door now, jaw working, eyes wet. Looked at Sophie, watching Nathan the way you watch someone you're no longer sure you know. Looked at the colonel. He gave me a single nod. I walked out of the dining room, through the hallway with its burgundy carpet and dim sconce lighting, through the front door and out into the English night. The car park was half full. Hills sat as black shapes against a navy sky. The air smelled of cedar and asphalt, and behind me I could hear the muffled hum of the restaurant. Music, dishes, the ordinary sounds of a place where most people were still having an ordinary evening. Nathan caught up to me at my rental car. "Claire, wait. Don't leave like this." I turned. He stood under a car park light, tie loosened, face flushed, looking younger than 28 and older than I'd ever seen him at once. "Like what, Nathan?" I didn't know she told them. I mean, I knew she said some stuff, but I didn't know she made up a whole... "You knew enough," I said. "You told me not to talk about the army stuff. You told Sophie I'd been traveling. You didn't lie as big as Mom, but you carried her bags." I was trying to protect... "Protect what?" I said. "Your insurance pitch to her dad?" He didn't answer. His mouth opened, closed. He looked at the ground, at his shoes, at the cracks in the asphalt, anywhere but at me. "Nathan," I said, "I love you. You're my brother. But I can't keep being the person this family is ashamed of when there's nothing to be ashamed of." He looked up, eyes wet, chin trembling. "When you're ready to know who I actually am, not who Mom told you I am, you know where to find me. Camp Ellsworth, 2nd Logistics Battalion. I'm not hard to find." I got in the car, shut the door, started the engine. He stood there under the light for a long time, watching me pull away. I learned later what happened after I left. Sophie pulled Nathan into a corner of the dining room. Her voice was low, but her words carried the same precision as her father's. "You told me she was a drifter, Nathan. She's a captain in the British Army. You lied to me." "I didn't lie, I let Mom handle the story. That is the lie." She walked away, back to her father's side. Nathan stood alone near the bread station, staring at the empty chair where I'd been sitting, at the challenge coin still resting on the table in front of my mother's untouched glass. The colonel spoke last. He addressed my mother directly, standing, hands at his sides. "Mrs. Whitfield, I respect your son. I care for my daughter, and I wish your family well. But I need you to hear this." He paused. "I've commanded thousands of soldiers over my career. I can tell you without hesitation that Captain Whitfield is someone I would trust with the lives of my own people. The fact that you couldn't see that's not her failure. That's yours." My mother sat alone at the table after that. Servers cleared the dessert plates around her. The white roses she'd arranged 2 hours earlier had already begun to droop. She didn't move. She didn't cry. She just sat there, holding the challenge coin in her palm, looking at it like she'd never seen one before in her life. I sat in my rental car in the car park for 5 minutes, engine running, headlights on, hills framed in the windshield like a postcard from somewhere I used to live. My phone rang. "Eleanor Ashford." "Captain Whitfield, I wanted to make sure you're all right." "I appreciate that, Mrs. Ashford. I'm okay." A pause, warm at the edges. "What you did in there, the restraint, the way you held your composure while your own mother was..." She stopped herself, started again. "That took more courage than anything I've seen at a dinner table, and I have sat at a great many dinner tables." "Thank you, ma'am. For what it's worth, Richard and I would be proud to have you at any table in our home. Anytime. You hear me? Anytime." I closed my eyes. That sentence, coming from a military spouse, a woman who understood exactly what service costs because she'd lived beside it for 30 years, meant more to me than every word my mother had withheld across 14 years. Not because Eleanor Ashford was someone important, because she was honest. "I'll remember that, ma'am," I said. "Thank you." I hung up and sat there in the quiet of the car, looked at the restaurant in the rearview mirror one last time. The lights were still on, people still inside, sorting through the wreckage of an evening that had started as an engagement dinner and ended as something else entirely. I put the car in drive, 7 hours back to Camp Ellsworth. I didn't put music on. I drove in silence, and somewhere on the motorway between Winchester and the county line, I said it out loud to nobody. I know exactly who I am to them and who I am without them. The road unspooled ahead of me, dark and straight and mine. 3 weeks later, I was back at Camp Ellsworth. Morning briefings, logistics meetings, supply manifests for the coming deployment. The routine that had always held me together. Nathan called twice. I picked up the second time. He apologized. Not the full apology, not the one that reaches all the way down to the root of it, but enough to crack the door open. "Sophie made me tell her everything," he said. "About the Army, about your deployments, about what Mom's been saying all these years. She said if I can't be honest about my own sister, how is she supposed to trust me to be honest about anything?" They were still engaged, but Sophie had set a condition. Nathan had to rebuild a relationship with me. On my terms. Not Margaret's. Not his. Mine. My mother never called. I'd expected that. Silence was her pattern. When she was confronted with a truth she couldn't manage or control, she went quiet, exactly the way her own mother had gone quiet before her. She never once saw the parallel. I didn't chase her. For the first time in 14 years, I didn't pick up the phone and try to bridge a gap she'd built with her own hands. For the first time, I let the silence be hers to break. One thing did arrive in the post. A handwritten note on cream stationery, no return address on the envelope. 2 sentences, written in the steady hand of a man who'd signed 1,000 orders in his life. "Captain, your service honors us all. Never let anyone reduce what you've earned." I pinned it to the corkboard above my desk, next to my deployment orders, right where I'd see it every single morning. I spent 14 years letting my mother's version of me be the only story anybody heard. And then one evening, at a dinner table in Winchester, a retired colonel asked one simple question, and I learned that the people who truly see you don't need your silence to stay standing beside you. That's my story. One phone call at 2 in the morning, one dinner, and one colonel who said what my mother never could. If this story reminded you that your service, whatever form it takes, matters, even when the people closest to you refuse to see it, share this with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for being here. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.